OE story. The fifth way to spell the long O sound is with OE, as in, rose. Compare short O with long O in these words: not, note, dot, dote, rot, wrote, wrote, cot, coat, cop, cope, mop, mope, lop, lope, pop, pope, sop, slope, hop, hope, hopped, hoped, hopping, hoping, rod, road, nod, node, odd, ode, cod, code, mod, mode, nod, node, stock, stoke, jock, joke, sock, soak, wok, woke, rob, robe, glob, globe, bon, bone, con, cone, tom, tome, comma, coma, Ross, rose, prose, prose, dos, dose, sol, soul, dol, dole. The R controls the sound of the vowel O in these words. Technically, they are spelled like long O, but what should have been a long O sound is distorted by the R. The storekeeper explored the idea of opening up a store near the seashore. The storekeeper's core belief was to think more before acting. The storekeeper tore down an old worn-out building. The storekeeper scored big after opening up his new store. The storekeeper was not bored. The storekeeper was not boring. The storekeeper did not feel any boredom. The storekeeper's mind contained law. Moreover, the storekeeper adored his customers. The storekeeper wished to be an explorer. The storekeeper had too many daily chores. The storekeeper was torn between wanting to travel and having to work. The storekeeper did not travel anymore. The storekeeper let a sigh and said, "Those were the days of yore." The storekeeper had a sore throat, but nothing could forestall the storekeeper's plans. The storekeeper dropped his oar in the water. The storekeeper did not ignore his oar. The storekeeper wore goggles and swore to find his oar. The storekeeper said that seashore is one word, not two. The OE words in a story about Rose. Rose chose her clothes carefully. Rose chose to close the door and try on some new clothes. Rose's clothes were always in vogue. Rose chose to buy an extra pair of pantyhose. Rose wore a nice cologne. Rose used a jump rope for her workout. Rose chose to pose for an audition. Rose chose to enclose a cover letter with her resume. Rose was not a dope. Rose did not like to mope. Rose was able to cope with any problem. Rose eloped to get married. Rose went to Rome and saw the Pope. Rose loped around in Rome near the Big Dome. Rose brought souvenirs made of chrome from Rome. Rose bought a tome from Rome to bring home with her. Rose left Rome to return to her home sweet home. Rose read a fable about a gnome that lived in Rome. Rose enjoyed reading about chromosomes. Rose chose to recite poetry and prose. Rose rose up early and drove around the orange grove. After that, Rose drove to the cove. Rose dove into the water at the cove. Rose used a rope and hove a rock at the cove. Rose came back home and listened to Beethoven's music. Rose made spaghetti sauce and froze it. Rose put 3 cloves of garlic in the sauce, put the sauce on the stove to simmer, and then sat down and wove a pair of mittens for her baby boy. Rose spoke on the phone with Rosemary. Rosemary, who is Rose's friend, chose to use rosemary in the cookie dough. Rose did own her home and didn't owe any money on it. "Owning a home feels much better than owing money," said Rose. Rose chose to buy a new water hose to water the backyard. Rose could not smell the roses because her nose was plugged. Rose chose not to be nosy when saying hello to her neighbors. Rose had many stands. Rose chose not to expose her children to candy. Rose chose to oppose smoking. Rose was opposed to drunken driving. Rose chose not to impose her choices on anyone. Rose chose to take the right dose of vitamins. Rose chose her dosage after reading the labels. Rose chose to dispose of her outdated tablets. Rose chose not to stay in her old comfort zone. Rose said, "Staying in a comfortable zone for a long time can cause a person to deteriorate." Rose wore her robe and sat down to think and contemplate. Rose was concerned about the future of our globe and the ozone layer. Rose thought that it was a miracle to clone Dolly, the sheep. Rose was a well-read person, and she studied the history of humankind since the Stone Age. Rose was a successful anthropologist and a single mom. Rose was often alone but not lonely. Rose's ex-parents-in-law helped her with some of her chores. They came over and used a hone to sharpen all of her kitchen knives. Rose was prone to postpone her trip to Rome, France. Rose had to have cortisone shot near her backbone. Rose had to take hormone replacements. Rose's dad, Mr. Coleman, was a loner. Mr. Coleman was lonesome because his wife had passed away. Mr. Coleman had a soft tone of voice. Rose's whole family was honest. Mr. Coleman dug a hole next to a tree bowl and hid his valuable coins in it. Rose never stole anything from her dad. Mr. Coleman used to be the sole owner of a shoe repair shop. During the days of yore, shop owners like Mr. Coleman were sole proprietors. Mr. Coleman was an artisan who knew how to fit a sole on a shoe. Rose played a good role in helping her father in his old age. Rose was a good role model for her sisters and brothers as they were growing up. All of Rose's siblings grew up to be good people. Rose's family had some difficulties during the time when her younger brother was in a major car accident. He was arrested for drunk driving after his car hit a big pole and a couple of pedestrians. Her brother served his time and was later let out on parole. Hope is Rose's younger sister. Hope was an attorney and an author. Hope spoke publicly about the characters in her book. One of the characters' names was Mr. Dole, and Mr. Dole had had a stroke because he used to smoke. Mr. Dole was about to choke when he woke up one night. Mr. Dole's smoking was no joke. Mr. Dole used to be a successful broker that went broke. When he was young and before his stroke, Mr. Dole used to play poker, watch TV late at night, and smoke. Playing poker provoked him to smoke more and more. Moreover, Mr. Dole drank lots of Coke instead of water. Mr. Dole felt yoked to poker and smoking. After his stroke, Mr. Dole became pokey and often sat by his fireplace doing nothing but stoking and poking the fire. Mr. Dole learned that the core of the problem that led to his stroke was the bad choices he had made when he was young. Meanwhile, he is also suing the tobacco companies for provoking him to smoke. Mr. Dole claims that their ads intentionally made smoking look cool, which provoked people to smoke. The court rejected Mr. Dole's case, but he swore he would invoke the case. The court's ruling was not to ignore the fact that Mr. Dole made a free choice when he went into a store and bought his first pack of cigarettes. Mr. Dole said, "I did not know then what I knows now." When Mr. Dole was a young man, he was the type that did not like to hear an advice from anyone. He thought that bad things could happen to other people but not to him. Mr. Dole had to explore everything and discover the answers the hard way. Mr. Dole didn't realize then that some of his bad choices would be irreparable. Mr. Dole said that he was bored a lot when he was young. Mr. Dole said that those were days of yore. All that Mr. Dole could recall was that out of boredom he explored cigarettes. He did remember how his stepfather used to snore and his snoring woke Mr. Dole up late at night. One night, Mr. Dole couldn't fall back asleep. He had finished all of his chores and then he was bored. Mr. Dole wore his jacket and headed to the store after midnight. Mr. Dole didn't know what to buy because he wasn't hungry, so he bought a pack of cigarettes. Since then, Mr. Dole became addicted to cigarette smoking and he adored watching TV late at night. Those TV commercials, Mr. Dole claims, made him believe that smoking was a real cool thing to do. Sure enough, Mr. Dole didn't score any coolness from smoking. All he got was soreness that tore up his body. Mr. Dole's body felt as if it were poked by a bull's gore. In her book entitled The History of Cigarette Commercials, Hope wrote a numerous analyses of all the commercials that were ever made throughout history to promote cigarette smoking. Critics said that her book contained lore. In the foreword, Hope dedicated her book to those suffering from second-hand smoke. Hope looked forward to seeing the foreword in her book being read by second-hand smokers. Another character in Hope's book suffered from both smoking and second-hand smoking. Hope showed the pictures of this character in her book. The woman was in her mid-30s, but looked like she was 100 years old. Her wrinkles were amazing. Doctors said that her pores were closed and blocked by smoke, and that air couldn't get through her pores. The woman who smoked had no idea that pores needed to breathe and that smoking and wrinkles were so closely related. She too had to learn the hard way. Later on, the latter character spent lots of time sitting at the seashore hoping to heal her pores and to explore a new way of life. Hope spoke about Mr. Dole's case before the judges. Hope said that Mr. Dole needed to appeal and to implore the judges to reconsider his case. Hope said that Mr. Dole didn't know and didn't have a special microscope to enable him to see what he was doing to his own body on the inside. Mr. Dole said that he hoped that someday someone would invent a special microscope for everyone to see inside of his or her own body. Only after his stroke did Mr. Dole have a clear idea of the scope of the damage done to his body. Hope raised one major point against tobacco companies in her book. Hope spoke and said, "After legalizing the sales of tobacco, The tobacco companies should not have been allowed to advertise, especially not in such cruel ways aimed directly toward deceiving the youth and the inexperienced. At the end of her speech, Hope apologized and said, "My apology if I am boring you. I care that we are all used to hearing and seeing stories with happy endings, and that is how life ought to be, and it would be that way without smoking. However, there aren't any stories about smoking that have happy endings. Smoking is no joking matter." Hope quoted her critics when she spoke. Hope tried to promote her book. Hope's listeners cast their votes after she spoke. Suddenly, Hope received a note from her remote cousin who was looking for her and found her after she spoke, and he saw her on the news. Hope's remote cousin used to write anecdotes. Hope's remote cousin doted on her. Hope's remote cousin was a very unusual person. A long time ago, he showed Hope how to build a cote for her birds. He owed Hope an apology for being away. Owing an apology didn't matter to Hope. Hope said, "No one owes me anything." Hope's cousin wrote her an ode. Hope became busy and had to hire another secretary. Hope wasn't prepared for her sudden fame, and she wasn't used to doing business in such a fast mode. Hope's temper was about to explode, but she controlled her temper. Hope had to devote some time to show her new secretary the difference between encoding and decoding, and said, "To encode is to convert plain language into codes. To decode is to convert codes into plain language." Hope also showed her secretary the different ways of spelling the long O sounds and said, "Rose sat on the king's throne. Mellow's sofa was thrown out. Rose was bored. Joan walked on the boardwalk. Rose was not alone. Joan had taken a loan from her bank. Rose is the sole owner of her company. Courtney prayed for his soul. Rose's leg was sore. Joan watched the prices soar. Rose's role was to be a role model. They will roll up their sleeves. Rose wore her new skirt. The war ended. Rose dug a hole, and her whole family watched her. Rose bumped her car into a pole. Paul is Paula's dad. No one stole Rose's car, its battery stalled. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to learn more.